All right, everyone, we'll get started in just a second. All right, so as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. My name is Rowan Howard. I'm a lecturer in environmental history at Monash University, and I will be the inexpert chair of this session of Making Public Histories today. I know a lot of the people here slash watching later on are MPH veterans, but for those of you who aren't, Making Public Histories is an online seminar series jointly organised by the History Council of Victoria, the Old Treasury Building, and Monash University's history program. It's essentially a chance to discuss and reflect on contemporary issues related to the production of history, connecting new practices and scholarship with a wide range of themes and issues. And this evening, we're going to be discussing what I think is one of the most dynamic and interesting fields of scholarship in Australian history as it is being produced today, which is the history of children and childhood, the precise title of which is going to be a question I will be asking very soon. This is a field that has intense contemporary interest and relevance, so I am really delighted to be joined by three historians who are well and truly at the vanguard of this field. So Catherine Gay completed her PhD as a Hanson PhD scholar at the University of Melbourne, where her research examined the lives of First Nations and settler girls in 19th century Australia, with a focus on the colony of Victoria. Emily Gallagher is a historian and research editor at the National Centre of Biography at the ANU. Her PhD thesis was a history of the childhood imagination in Australia and won the Australian Historical Association Searle Award in 2024. And Emily is currently working on a book for La Trobe University Press. And Isobelle Barrett Meyering is a historian of Australian feminism, childhood, and the family based at Macquarie University. And her book, Feminism and the Making of a Child Rights Revolution, was published by Melbourne Uni Press in 2022. So before we get started, just a reminder that this is a webinar. So if you have any questions, and I have no doubt that you will, please just submit them via the Q&A function, and that will flag them for our presenters to discuss. You can submit your questions at any time, but we're going to be doing, I think, about 45 minutes of sort of structured discussion with some pre-circulated questions first, and then we'll flip over to that. But do feel free to kind of flag questions at any time as you think of them. Um, as Zoom probably has already told you, this meeting is being recorded, but rest assured that only our presenters are being recorded. And I've also been reminded that I need to say that if you still use Twitter and you are tweeting about the webinar, please tag at history_Vic to kind of follow along. So I think that covers all of our housekeeping things. So I might just leave this image up for a minute before we switch to our kind of default view. And the first question I do want to ask is that sometimes you hear people talking about histories of childhood, histories of children, children's history. Can you tell me what is the difference and how would you define the field that you're all working in?
You want to go, Em? You jump in. Okay, all right. I'll get us started. I just want to say, obviously, thank you to Rowan, and thank you to the History Council of Victoria for hosting this session. It's super exciting, and we're all really glad and pleased to be here. Um, the difference between the two is not that complicated and quite straightforward, which is that histories of childhood are more about, I suppose, histories that look at imaginings of children's experiences or particularly how adults, I suppose, have imagined the childhood experience. Whereas histories of children in particular are more really about histories of children from the child's perspective, more so. So this includes work particularly in the folklore space, but also work such, I suppose, some of my work, which really looks at children's imaginative lives and the ways in which they've experienced, I suppose, different parts of the past. Yeah, I'm not sure if Isobelle or Kat wanted to add to that. Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I just want to echo the thanks to Rowan and History Council, Monash, and Old Treasury for having us today. It's really a privilege to be able to speak about children's history, which we are all really fascinated with. And yeah, and just jumping off Em's point, yeah, I think it's kind of seen as a bit of a binary in the field, like childhood and children. It's kind of seen as these oppositional kind of forces in a way, thinking about childhood as a category of how adults have defined a child, like by age or kind of other kind of factors. Yeah, so which intersects with like race and ethnicity and other kinds of things, like who is a child and how it kind of is the world and society and culture defining childhood as a time of life and like kind of like a phase in which someone will go through before they reach adulthood, which is also a phase of life. And then yeah, children, I think spoke to that really well, is more about children's the experience of the child, whether that's through their imaginative worlds or experiences in other kind of facets of their life, how children like think and feel and perceive the world around them, like children's own thoughts and perspectives is kind of how I see it. But yeah, I think the field is kind of position these as two different things, and I think they are different things, but they intersect a lot. And the way that childhood is conceptualized often inflects how children think about themselves as children and think about childhood and imagine their own childhoods. And the other way too, children themselves influence who is thought to be a child and how childhood is conceptualized by broader society as well.
I will add into, I think that's probably a point I'd take off to, which is that often you end up doing both at the same time.
Mm.
But probably a lot of scholars would see themselves maybe doing one more than the other as well. And some people might have more skills around answering one set of questions or feel more sort of tied and committed to one side of that. I guess maybe another thing to think about here too is we've talked about childhood, but a lot of us might talk about childhood and youth as well. And that's a question we're often examining in our histories itself, is what is childhood? Where does it begin and end? What is youth? How do these things speak to each other? So I think there's a lot of movement between different areas within the field as well. And as a field more generally, and we can talk more about this, I think history of childhood brings in scholars who perhaps are more interested in the family or in schooling or particular institutions to do with childhood. And so they might be seeing themselves in those spaces as well.
Brilliant. I'm just going to stop that share, and we can come back to those images later on, I'm sure. I think it's a really brilliant introduction and sort of leads into, I think, a question of, so how did you get into this field? Where do you see yourself fitting into this kind of field? And maybe you can each tell us just a little bit about your work, your interests. We've obviously mentioned some of the stuff you have done, but also things that you are working on into the future as well.
Mm. Yeah, I can go first. I feel like I came to children's history through a classic undergraduate path interested in women's history. I think my work looks at girls specifically, so I think I definitely came to girls through a lens of gender history and women's more traditional women's history potentially earlier on in my undergraduate. But I started thinking about, yeah, these conceptions of age, which a lot of children's historians are looking at, is like how does age kind of interact with people's lives? How does age kind of change over time? How we conceptualize how people of different age brackets are like meant to do certain things or live a certain way. So yeah, I started thinking about how gender and age kind of intersect, and that's how I came to looking at girls in colonial Australia. And I thought the colonial period was really interesting because there's so many children in 19th century Australia compared to adults. Like the mortality rate's quite high. A lot of children pass away, but still lots of adults are passing away as well and not living into later life. So you have this kind of glut of young people, I suppose, living in the colonies towards the end of the 19th century. But there wasn't a lot of scholarship on them and not a lot of work that had looked to thinking about how children and young people, and particularly young female people, had kind of experienced that world, but also kind of shaped it and been kind of intrinsically part of it. So yeah, that's kind of where I started with my research. And it also came from an interest in museums and museum collections. And I think children, we'll probably talk about this later, but I think children's history is a really makes you look at different sources and different materials. And I think I was really interested in using material culture alongside other more traditional archival sources. And children's history was really perfect for that kind of thing. Yes.
I mean, I too have come through women's history into the history of childhood. So I think a similar path, and I think that actually is a real factor in the field more generally too. And I guess I came from being interested in political movements and specifically in feminist activism in the 1970s. And so it was really embarking in my PhD research, and still really trying to figure out a question in those early stages of the research of what I was looking for. But I started coming across material about children's liberation in the 1970s within feminist archives and thinking, what is this? Why doesn't anyone talk about the idea of children's liberation? We hear about a lot of other liberation movements from this era. And that sparked my interest and resulted in me pursuing that topic first for an article and then realizing there was more to say. And I guess I've come out of that having completed my PhD and book, and then sort of moved on to a new project around the history of children's rights. From there, realizing that there is just quite a big gap in the field too, I think, and that there's a lot more to be said about the history of children and children's rights in Australia.
Look, I think my interest in children is a bit longer. I did initially train as a teacher, and I worked throughout my undergraduate studies kind of part-time in childcare. I kind of left that industry really not wanting to do anything with children. And I kind of came to Canberra and initially did a kind of social and cultural history really of war for my honours. But I actually found that kind of in a way that kind of sent me back to children. I think I found working in that kind of a darker, I suppose, sphere of Australian history emotionally a bit difficult. And so in a way I kind of did a backflip and kind of turned back to children. And so I think that's kind of my interest has been longer and more enduring. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think that's really interesting, and the sort of the opposite directions in which you come to it, and how that does kind of appear in your work in a little bit as well. Um, so I wonder if thinking a bit about the field more generally again, if you can comment at all on sort of where does the field come from? Because I know, Emily, you mentioned earlier kind of the relationship with folklore studies. There's obviously this connection that's becoming really clear with women's history and gender history. Where does this field of children's history slash histories of childhood come from? What's behind the sort of rise of it internationally and in Australia? Is there anything you can comment on that at all?
I mean, I can kick us off. I think often children's historians, or sometimes, as we say, historians of children and youth, often kind of turn to a kind of canonical text, which we call which is called Centuries of Childhood by Philip Ayres. I think that was published, one of you can probably correct me, in the 1960s.
Yes, I think it was, French then English translation. And it took a little while to kind of like disseminate into the English speaking world, but the French were all over it first.
Yeah, and so the field's kind of been seen almost as a reaction to some of that work. I do think personally that there is a much longer history around really working on children, which is really in the space of kind of folklore studies, which really dates back, I think, to the 1900s and even 1800s, this interest in children's culture, in children's rhymes, and in children's games. Although the evolution of how scholars have, I suppose, imagined what children are doing when they play has changed quite dramatically since those times. But really, the new social history movement, 1970s and 80s, children's history kind of, I suppose, blossomed a little bit within kind of that period. But I think, and maybe the others will disagree, has kind of limped along a little bit in Australia, really since the turn of the century, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, internationally it seems, the rise of social history and women's history as well definitely brought this kind of idea of, subaltern or like minority kind of voices to the fore, and kind of like reading against the grain to find the child's voice or like children's perspectives definitely fit within this kind of broader narrative to bring working class people and women to a lesser extent, definitely to a much lesser extent. And the initial kind of histories of childhood from my perspective from the 1970s and into the early 80s are often very negative. They're kind of like comparing contemporary child rearing practices and how adults and parents are kind of treating children to the past. And they're kind of, a lot of them somewhat have this narrative or are contesting a narrative that we're better at parenting now than we were 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, etc., which I think this field kind of got a bit bogged down in for a little while. And definitely kind of in Australia, I think that is kind of seen in the focus on children's welfare, and like people looking at orphanages and asylums and things like that for children, which is fascinating work, but is very dark and is kind of this traditionally critical narrative of how adults and the state have kind of treated children. And I think it's really important work, but it kind of, I think for 20 or 30 years, it really was like the mainstay of, I suppose, Australian children's history. Yeah, but Isobelle, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think it may be another thing to just note there too is that the history of childhood has also grown alongside childhood studies more generally. The history, like sociology of childhood, has been a big area of growth as well. And the two have sort of spoken to each other in different ways. This sort of interest in the idea that childhood is a historical, or as an invention of modernity, for example, which is part of the Philip Ayres kind of argument that sort of flowed into sociology. And so history has been quite an important discipline for other fields as well. So I think that's, an important thing to think about alongside perhaps the sociology of childhood took off more successfully, though, in some ways for a period. That's sort of, I think another thing that I've been interested too is also the ways in which the history of childhood has actually been sort of deployed in political movements as well. So as the field of the history of childhood sort of emerging in the 1960s and 70s, that actually gets taken up by children's rights activists to be used in ways to agitate for children's rights. So I think there's lots of interesting ways in which the broader social and political context also shapes the field, and the field shapes the wider context too.
There's also, I suppose, too, like obviously intersections. Children are everywhere in society, but obviously historians of education working in that space as well have done really important work, really in children's history. And I think sometimes, particularly, can they really speak to the Australian setting? Actually, children's historians and historians of education are not necessarily communicating with each other very well. We kind of have different, I suppose, kind of groups and different networks, and the kind of, but that work really has kind of gone alongside each other really for the last 50 years. But yeah, that's kind of one of those kind of tensions, I think, here in Australia, where we don't do enough work together, actually.
Yeah,
because history of education has often been within schools of education, if you think in a university setting, at least.
That's true.
So that has contributed to a sense of who is the audience there, and sometimes it's shaped by those sort of structures within a university context in particular.
Yeah, definitely. And just to jump off Isobelle's point before, yeah, I think the linking broader kind of like cultural and social shifts to the rise of children's history, like you're saying, is really key. Like I think the increasing interest in children's welfare, children's psychology, children's lives and sociology and education kind of coincides a lot with increasing children's history scholarship. And you're right, I think it's like we're living in like the 20th century seen as his century of the child, and children kind of have like very central place in like Western society, at least, or global North societies. So I think that kind of ties into it a lot as well.
This is all really fascinating stuff, and I don't want to get bogged down in too many of the pre-planned questions because it's far more interesting to just hear you talk. So when I was showing the images that you provided before, that wonderful collage, I've been informed that one of you, and I'm not going to out which one of you it is pictured in that image, which I think does raise a really interesting question, which is, has your own experience of childhood shaped your research, or has your research changed the way you reflect on your own childhood experiences? Is there anything that anyone would like to comment on that at all?
Look, Kat and I have talked about this a great deal. I only really became consciously aware, I think, that this was kind of something that was happening when I was doing work, was that I kind of was making assumptions about children's experiences in the past based on my own personal experience. And it was shaping my own interests, the way I undertook my research, and also some of the kind of, as I said, the kind of assumptions that I was making about children's experiences. And in particular for me, I mean, I often looked back at my childhood as a very playful and imaginative childhood. I think part of that I always explained as I was the eldest of four, and my childhood was kind of longer, I think, than a lot of other children at that time, partly because I was tied to a play environment with my younger siblings that perhaps other people aren't necessarily tied to. And I think my interest in the imagination and in children's imaginative lives kind of stemmed out of that experience and out of that remembered past. Um, and I think, I don't know, it's kind of a hard question that you ask, because I think my research also has affected the way I imagine my childhood. And you even see that happen in other settings when you do oral histories or when you're in kind of a public setting and you talk about your work, the ways in which audience members, say, for example, it may happen today, reimagine or reconstruct their own memories of the past based on what they've heard. And so childhood and memories of childhood are kind of this constant reworking of ourselves, of that kind of formative part of our lives for the present moment. And I've always been really interested in that. And I think Kat too, and I'm sure Isobelle also kind of gone through this kind of similar difficult kind of thought process, I suppose, when you're working on children and youth in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have. Yeah, Em and I have spoken about this at great length because it is fascinating. Like the objective, there's no such thing as objectivity, but the objective historian going and looking at the archive. But I feel like especially children's history, because everyone's experienced childhood, and I feel like we have this sense of ownership over childhood in some ways. Like I feel myself thinking that sometimes, or and because we've gone through it, we've experienced it, and it definitely inflects the way we do our work. And I think identifying as a woman, identifying as a girl, I started my research really into girlhood when I was like 21 or 22, and I still felt like a girl. So I felt very connected to my subjects. And I think, I find myself, I researched like hundreds of girls for my thesis and like read about their lives and their diaries and their letters and their memoirs. And I think, I think my childhood and my girlhood experience of growing up with a sister and lots of cousins and that kind of thing, that kind of idea of play and having this kind of, I suppose, a positive childhood has kind of inflected my work in a way. I think I look for the positive experiences of girls from the past and in the 19th century, and moments of connection and joy and love and friendship has definitely come through in my work. And I think it might have a bit to do with my own girlhood and my own childhood, because that's kind of what I privileged growing up. But it's interesting to think about. And like rereading, I was looking at my thesis the other day. I'm like, gosh, I feel like a lot of me has come through this. Especially, I have a chapter on sisters, and I have one sister, and I think that was very much inspired by our kind of like angst and the tensions that we experienced together. And I think the central kind of thinking I had in that is like, did sisters have a similar relationship like this in the past? Like, can we see difference? What are the similarities and differences between siblings' relationships today and in the past? And can we kind of see similar tenets? So definitely has inflected my work. Yeah.
I would say the same too, but maybe I haven't reflected on it quite as much. I maybe should reflect more in terms of some of that kind of, I guess one thing that strikes me is that an interest in children's rights and in children's political activity in particular, I think comes from feeling like children shouldn't be underestimated, and a sense that for myself, I had some fairly strong views from when I was relatively young. And I guess I was raised also in a context of a family that talked quite a lot about politics and was engaged in political activity at various points. So that obviously has been my experience. It's not everyone's experiences, but that's probably driven some of my desire to take children's political interest seriously, and to think more about how it can be documented and think, and I guess I'm also conscious now that there are events that I'll be looking at that I have participated in as well. So, and that I have some records to bring to the work as well. So I think, Emily, you sort of write a little about this too, that as historians, we should maybe start thinking about creating collections ourselves and being conscious of that. So we probably all have our own little collections at home as well that we can think about in that work. And that's something I've reflected on a little bit as well.
I think That's a really good leaping off point for the next question that I did want to ask, which was about sort of the archive and the archive for histories of children, childhood, and youth. That is it a different kind of archive? We do have people that it's almost perfectly planned of kind of the 19th century through to pretty much contemporary history represented here. And so I guess, yeah, I'm just curious if you can comment at all about the kind of archive that exists for your histories. Where is it located? What is in it? And how does it differ from the other kinds of historical archives?
So should we work backwards? Do you want to start, Isabella? Talk about
Yeah.
plethora of things available to you. No, I'm
Mhm.
joking.
Yeah,
Get
okay,
into the
sure.
19th century.
Well, I guess a lot of the archives I've used have been about finding children more within a broader archive. I think that's um, generally, it just so far in the work I've done, it's often been working with a particular political movement and then looking through that to find evidence of children's participation and presence, um, and trying to think about how you might then draw out their experiences. But I guess I probably am one of those people who've been as much concerned with what adults think about children as well. So I think that's probably different to some of Emily and Kat's work. So yeah, I guess sometimes you're looking through a very large quantity of material to find just a few small things, but that's important to bring to those histories, I think. And over time, I've probably got better at thinking about where I might find children and larger collections, the presence of children in political movements as well. And I guess maybe then there has been about thinking about beyond textual records. And I guess we could all probably talk a little bit more about that, and that we need to be thinking about visual records and material culture and a much wider range of records in the work we do. That's probably enough for me for now.
Did you want to comment, Emily?
Yes. I mean, look, I've been a bit of a critic of what the field has really called a problem of sources, or which I've kind of called the narrative of fragments, that has really kind of become one of those, I think, central narrative pillars of the field, which is the idea that children's voices and that children's or child-authored materials are rare and difficult to find. Obviously, it very much depends on the children that you're looking for in the archive, and each study is different. But in my case, which is really my period especially, which is really 1890s to the Second World War, that period, trying to find child-authored material, it was not difficult. It is everywhere. Yes, it's not catalogued as child-authored material, and the provenance under which children's material is often collected by archives is different, but it is there. It is there in the big archives, but also I've found it's actually very prominent in regional and local collections. And so kind of one of the things that I did for my PhD was really kind of try and get out to those kind of smaller communities, those smaller local organizations that collected a more wider range of materials, because the provenance was more about where someone lived or who they were in their youth than necessarily who they became in later life. So I think in a way, children's material can be hard to find because it's not identified in the same way as a lot of adult material. But I've also found that it is kind of, I don't know, it really is everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and especially, yeah, like Em and I have talked about a bit about this before as well. Like that Em's period is like very much this like explosion of education and resources and materials available, and it's like amazing how much stuff has survived. Yes, and I definitely recommend Em's article. It's in the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth if anyone's interested in this narrative of fragments. It's really useful pointing out, and I suppose like laying out the kind of, I suppose, the opportunities children's historians do have, especially in Australia, to find these materials. It's very eloquent piece, kind of pushing against this, what you've said, this kind of is a narrative that's kind of underpinned a lot of other people's work, which, it may be true in some cases. Like, I think the further you go back in the past, it is a lot harder. But yeah, I think Em's work really speaks to that really well. And yeah, I was similar. I was very inspired by Em actually. I started my PhD a little bit after Em to go out into the regions, and I went to lots of regional historical societies and I went to lots of museums and regional museums, and also looked at state collections in Melbourne. But yeah, it's kind of this, they're often hidden in these bigger collections. And often, as Isobelle said, you're kind of finding little scraps and little bits of information in bigger collections that might not necessarily be identified as relating to children, but you can piece those together to create a really rich narrative, I think, and have some really interesting insights. Yeah, you might not find a lot from one person, for instance, but you might find little bits and pieces from lots of people that you can put together to kind of create a broader argument.
And also then there can be questions of what you choose to foreground when you are writing something, because whether you let those, if you are working with material where you felt like children's presence is not so strong in that archive, but it is there, then you can start thinking about, do I want to just bring out that presence more? Do I want to really think about what that material tells me rather than letting that be overwhelmed by all the other material you might have found? I think that's another way to approach that too, that I've found helpful.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, Kat, if you wanted to say a little bit about, obviously you more than Isobelle and I have really worked with material history and the material archive. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously that is also now a really kind of cutting edge work that's going on. Is it, how can we think about using objects as a kind of access point into children's experiences and even children's self-expression in the past as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think looking to the 19th century, there's a lot of written sources, but a lot of the material I was coming across were material culture artifacts and objects such as needlework, such as needlework samplers, which girls would do as part of their education, or scrapbooks and craft, quilts, weaving, lots of different like kind of material objects that had a lot did have provenance, and we knew who made it, and we knew often it was if it was a girl, where she made it, and yeah, I use these kind of objects as, I suppose, a way into girls' lives, and yeah, thinking about how moving beyond the textual archive, moving beyond I suppose the adult created archive, as well as even textual sources written by children, which are really insightful and really interesting, but how we can kind of bring all of those together to kind of create a broader picture of children's lives and what girls were making. I kind of argue in my thesis, and what they're sewing and what they're drawing, what they're writing, is often equally as important as what adults are saying about them, as to kind of understand their experiences and how they're perceiving their world and thinking about the people around them and thinking about what's happening to them. The objects can say a lot about what they're being taught and how they're being taught to be girls, and how they're kind of, I suppose, experiencing the world.
So I think there's a question in the Q&A that I think is sort of a follow-up to immediately this point. So I thought I might throw it over to you, where it says, would it be a reasonable hypothesis to respond to child-authored material is everywhere, to say yes, but predominantly in middle-class culture? And I'm fairly confident you have some thoughts on these, so I'm going to throw it open to you.
I suppose I said children's culture is everywhere, so that's me. Look, yes, it is true often that elite and middle class childhoods are more visible, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the predominant voice in the archive. And I think Trove has been really critical, especially for me, for some of the work that I've done around this period. As Kat mentioned, there was kind of a progressive education movement around the turn of the century, which really put pen and paper into the hands of young people on a scale that we kind of hadn't really seen before. And it empowered a lot of young people to write. One of the things that came out of this was children's pages in newspapers. Children would write to children's page editors, and then their letters would be published in the newspapers. These often were weekly or monthly kind of 2-page spreads in some cases. And that's a good example, just one, of where we see a whole range of voices by young people being represented and preserved in the archive, almost accidentally in a way, or at least unintentionally, on a large scale. And I think even when I've kind of gone out to a lot of these like local museums and local historical societies, the variety of like school exercise books, child art, diaries, letters that are kept, it is really surprising, actually, and quite remarkable. At the same time, yes, I do think, obviously, particularly, I think in larger archives, such as state libraries and museums, children who had kind of middle class or elite childhoods are usually better represented, but not always and not exclusively. I would say in my experience and for my work, but it does depend, I think, on the nature of the work that you're doing and the questions that you're asking.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like, yeah, a lot of the sources that I have in my thesis looking at, 19th century girlhoods, a lot are from middle class and elite girls. But yeah, as Em says, towards the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, we see this kind of not democratization of education, but more and more children being able to read and write and having access to resources. And I came across a lot of exercise books and scrapbooks because it was a lot cheaper to have paper and a lot cheaper to have these materials from working class girls and girls who were from very like poor backgrounds, going to state schools, and who've just somehow these have survived. I don't know how. There's a scrapbook in Museums Victoria's collection, which is from a girl who grew up in Woods Point, which is like a tiny rural gold mining community. Her dad was a subsistence miner. They didn't really have a lot of money, but it was kept by her family and it's been donated. So there are things in the archive from working class children and children who may not have been from elite backgrounds that you can find, and you can privilege these and like use these as kind of like key sources in your work as well.
I guess too, for those who are working with more state-based records, whether that's school records or welfare institutions. Sometimes it's not directly children's voices there, but they are there in different ways, and it's depending on how you're reading those sources too. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, and it's surprising where children's voices appear in the archive. Like I looked at coronial inquest records of like into death, and there's a lot of children. It's not verbatim, their testimony is not written down verbatim, but it's lots of children's testimony, especially if another child has passed away or died in an accident. A child will give testimony at a coronial hearing, and there's their voice and they're often their signature as well in these records. So if you think, yeah, as Isobelle was kind of saying before, kind of thinking where children might be, like where might children be, you can kind of find these really surprising sources and children's voices and perspectives in really surprising places.
Yeah, I think it's a really, sorry, Emily.
I was just going to add, I don't know, perhaps one of many explanations for some of this is that people keep their childhood, a lot of people keep their childhood materials for a long time. They're treasured, they're precious, and they sometimes are preserved against the odds and passed down across generations. And I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which that kind of material for that reason has then been preserved. So maybe there is kind of this treasuring of childhood, this nostalgia for the childhood experience, which has ultimately played out in a way that has meant that some of these materials are preserved against the odds. Might be one explanation for that, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a really great answers to that question, and made me realize, bouncing off Kat's point, that I work on Antarctic history, and the amount of child-authored material that ends up preserved because of that is actually really interesting. That there's all these kind of letters to Antarctic explorers and things like that get produced because, anything that attracts children, then it becomes a novelty from that other kind of archival perspective as well. So I think it's a really great response. The other thing I wanted to ask about archives is just because I know some of the material you have used, and there's some really fascinating examples. Is there any particular kind of archival find that you would want to share that you have found that was particularly significant for whatever reason?
Good question. Do either of you anything spring to mind?
I think early on in my research, I came across a feminist high school group's set of records. And what was striking was the sort of the minute note, like the notes from meetings that were very detailed, and even some of the debates they had themselves as a group about did they want to branch out and invite adults to join the group, for example, and how that had been sort of recorded in their discussions. And, clearly someone held on to those records, both at the time in terms of keeping minutes of meetings and keeping copies of the kind of pamphlets and other materials they were generating. But I just remember coming across this little this file, and at the time, sort of, I guess it really made me think, oh wow, there is this sort of material out there if I look for it. So that was now probably 8-10 years ago. So it still stays in my mind though.
I got there. This is such a hard question because I have so many, I have so much cool material. It's kind of amazing, actually. I think maybe for me, like one of the more significant collections that I feel like was in obscurity and kind of still is in a way until I accidentally stumbled upon it, is the Frances Durham Art Collection at the National Gallery of Australia, which is a large collection of over 10,000 works of child art, which was collected from children across the world, really between, I think, 1920 and 1970. It's this kind of extraordinary collection of children's creative work and imaginative activity, which I found to be really inspiring and really rich. In particular, there's a group of I suppose children's paintings, children's drawings in the collection, which were collected by Frances Durham, who was an art educator from Hermannsburg. Those works were done for her, so she says, by Aranda children out there in the Central Desert. And it really are representations of country and of people. And these kinds of kind of rare gems, these groups of collections of child art, I think are just a reminder of kind of the surprises of the archive and their power. So I think for me, that collection was probably one of the more significant finds during my work, I'd say.
Yeah, they're amazing. But slightly hard to access. Is that
They are slightly hard to access, yes.
Yeah. No, they sound amazing. I'm trying to think, I have so many gems. Like it was amazing how much stuff I found. Like I've got an archive. I think I put an appendix at the end of my thesis, and I think I had like 350 things, which doesn't seem like a lot, but is a lot from the 19th century and all from Victoria. That were written by girls or made by girls or drawn by girls. So, and I didn't get to look at all of them in my thesis. So there's a wealth of, so once my thesis gets unembargoed, there's a wealth of material out there for everyone to look at. But I think like I think the archival find that I was like, yes, I found it. One of my chapters, I looked at a Djadjaran girl whose name was Ellen, and I worked with the Djadjaran Clans Corporation and Auntie Marilyn Nichols, who's a Jara elder, on this chapter. And Ellen, she was born in around 1850 and she grew up in Franklinford near Daylesford at like the Loddon Aboriginal Protectorate Station. And she's been mentioned in a few histories for crocheting a collar and a doily. So crochet pieces and writing some letters and sending them to Queen Victoria when she was about 13 years old. And she's mentioned in a couple of histories as a bit of a footnote or a bit of like an interesting anecdote of an Aboriginal girl like creating these materials and sending them away. So I found her fascinating. I just wanted to, like, I suppose, draw out more about her life and think about her as a political actor, as well as an individual rather than this kind of like shadowy figure that a lot of historians have painted her as. So I was able to piece together. I wasn't able to find her collar and doily or her letters, but I suppose in the absence, I think I've been able to confirm that they probably don't exist anymore. They've probably been destroyed. But I did find in the archive some of her writing. So I found she wrote these handwriting exercises, like copying out lines for a teacher. Compare past woes to present felicity was one of them. And the other set says duties demand attention and method. And she's written it down about 14 times and signed her name and the date at the end. And finding those, I don't think anyone had looked at them before, was pretty amazing, like having this handwriting, this material that she herself had written. And I've been able to kind of photocopy all this material and give it back to the Djadjaran, and they've been really really enjoyed kind of learning about her and I suppose like relearning an ancestor in their life through that process, which has been really rewarding.
I'm rapidly realizing that we probably could have just had an entire session just on talking about archives.
Yeah.
Which is probably true for any historians, really. So before I move on, I did just want to mention there's a sort of a comment in the Q&A that says that I work in a local history centre for a public library service in Metro Melbourne area. We have a range of sources from/about children, both working class and middle to upper class, school prizes, welfare programs, etc., etc. And I think that really just reflects that part of this has been a tribute to the variety of archives that are out there and the importance of using those kind of local archives and oral history collections and regional archives and all these kinds of things. So I think that's really a fantastic thing that's come out of this discussion. I also wanted to talk a bit, about public history specifically, that I think a feature of all your work, as someone who reads it, is a commitment to accessible histories, to public histories, to publishing in an accessible fashion, to producing exhibitions and things like that. So, if you agree with that characterization of your work, what do you see as the benefit of this kind of accessible and publicly engaged sort of history of children and childhood and youth?
I feel like Kat should kick us off as the person who can really lend credit to doing exhibition work. Yeah.
Yes, curator here. No. Yes, I've been yeah, I think it's so important. I think I've come to history from a public history standpoint. I've always wanted to work in museums and kind of be in a more public history museum facing role. So I think it's always been a driving force of my work. But I think especially for children's history, like thinking about girls and girlhood, I did an exhibition in collaboration with the National Trust in Heritage Victoria, as well as Dr. Sarah Sardo and Maddie Miller, who's at Melbourne Uni, about girls in 19th century Victoria, which was partly based on my PhD thesis and also based on my co-curator's research. And I think that really got me thinking about like what can looking at children in the past and particularly girls like help us with today, and why is it important to do it in an accessible way so girls themselves, I think, can understand it, so children themselves can understand what we're saying about children from the past, as well as to kind of, in a way, think about how children I suppose, thought about today and treated today. And girls are, if you look at the statistics, and Plan International is an amazing organization who looks to girls' welfare and children's welfare in the world, and girls are still the most marginalized and I suppose yeah, they're the most affected by war, environmental disaster, and things like that. So I think by looking at girls in the past, we can kind of see how a lot of the issues that girls in the past faced are not being resolved and are still ongoing and lingering. And I think help us think about how children's lives in the present are really, yeah, really important and can really like tell us a lot about our society and how we value people and humanity as well. So yes, but yeah, I think always been a really big part of my work is thinking about how to make it as accessible as possible to both young people and to adults, and how to make it, I suppose, a little bit political in a way, like Isabelle's work does too. Yes, I'm done.
I think maybe is.
Yes, no, I mean, I agree with those points, and I think these. I think what Kat was saying both about that this is important for children today, but also for adults today to be critically thinking about how they treat children. I think that is an important audience for this work, and that adults come in different positions of power to children too, whether that's as teachers, parents, working other childcare settings, in juvenile justice, in youth work, social work settings, all sorts of ways in which adults are involved in children's lives and in positions of power. And so I guess in terms of my work, which has really been around the history of children's rights and children's political activism, that is one of the great things about the discipline of history generally, is that we often see our audience as not just other scholars, and some are more focused on just the more scholarly community, but history is a field that is often speaking a bit more publicly as well. And I think in terms of the history of childhood, it has been present in political debates in lots of different ways. And some of the work that's been done by historians hasn't been in the context of, for example, government inquiries. That has actually generated new histories and been really important for the field. If we're looking at things like the history of children in institutions, for example, or child removal.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. Just I suppose just really, I don't know, I think part of my training, not as a children's historian, but just as a historian, as an academic, has really been around doing public-facing history. We are, in many ways, public servants. If we're not doing this work for the public, for the people, what are we doing it for? And so for me, I hope that whatever happens in the future, that it remains a feature of how I go about doing any kind of academic work. It's really for the public and for the Australian people especially, I think.
Very well said. I think that's really great. And, that's why we should probably also plug that you can still get Isabelle's book for the low price of $35. And, that is one of the features of kind of the publishing that is being done, is that it is accessible in that way as well, that not only through public history, but through kind of affordable history. And I think that's really, really important. The other question I did want to ask on this, and you've already sort of engaged with it, I think, but I think it is worth asking, is, we have these things about policy debates about children. The big one that I've read a bit about has been about, does the Environment Minister have a legal obligation to protect children from the harms of climate change? But other things around kind of the minimum voting age, stuff like that. Do you think children's history has a role in these kinds of policy debates about children? Is it already contributing to it? Do you think it could do more? Do you have any thoughts on that potentially tricky question?
Which I should say, watch this space, because my new project is a history of children and Australian democracy. So that is a longer project over the next 5 years, let's say. So I hope it does feed into some of those debates. But even just thinking about that project, and you mentioned the right to vote, or the minimum age for voting. One thing I've even been struck by too is how in some of the arguments that are put forward for lowering the age to vote, often people might also appeal to other political movements and how, for example, women didn't have the right to vote in the past, and that's changed. And so these kind of historical arguments in different ways get used to make arguments about the rights of children too. So histories in general get brought into policy debates, whether it's histories of childhood or whether it's the broader histories as well. So I think history is often being mobilised in different ways in the public sphere, and this no different when we're talking about children.
I just would agree and echo that. I myself haven't done much work in this space, but children's historians have, particularly around obviously histories of child welfare, histories of education. So I think even historians and children's folklorists have kind of done work in this space, particularly in regards to playground. Particularly during COVID, I'd say there were actually a lot of older children's folklorists who kind of reanimated by some of the restrictions around children's play activity during that period. So I think historians do have a responsibility, I suppose, to contribute to public debate where that's appropriate and where it's relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I haven't worked much in this space, but yeah, just thinking about, children have always been, I suppose, legislated in a way. There's so many, if you look at the 19th century, you see this raft of laws kind of legislating and regulating children's lives, and age kind of going up and down, such as age of consent laws, education, compulsory ages of education, the Neglected Children's Act, which kind of, I suppose, imposed reformatories and orphanage kind of ages on children who were neglected by their families. So yeah, we often see children being legislated and kind of brought up in policy decisions, not necessarily just to do with children, but to do with a whole raft of other things to do with family and other kind of policies, and often previous legislation and previous kind of historical moments being used to kind of argue for or against certain legislation and certain policies for children. So yeah, I think historians, we can have a lot to do and say. I think Isabelle's upcoming project will have a lot to kind of contribute to that field. It'll be very important work.
Definitely, yeah. So watch this space. So, I mean, I've got a bunch of other questions I would love to talk about, but I don't want to, abuse my privilege of being able to ask them. So, I want to open it up to people to share more questions. We've got at least two to raise kind of immediately, but please feel free to keep putting your questions into the Q&A. And the first one I think is especially for Isobelle, but touches on all of you, where it says, "Can we talk about children's rights when they usually don't know they have them, or if they do, can't exercise them?" And I think that's an interesting question for all of you in a sense, but I might throw to Isobelle first if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think we can talk about how adults view children's rights to start with. And I guess that's where my work started. And then it's a question of thinking beyond that. And often that the history of children's rights is about the history of the abuse of children's rights. You could say that too. But I think also that children do have a sense of their rights in different ways, articulate that in different ways. They might not know all the legal rights they might have, but they might have a sense of what's right and just from their perspective. And I think, certainly in the last 10 years, 20 years, there has been a lot more kind of push and push through public policy and programs in different ways to have children's rights education. So there's definitely a space there for also then thinking about how might understanding the history of children's rights feed into the way we generate those sort of discussions today with children as well. But I definitely take the point there about the fact that there's a lot of children's rights talk, and there can be a big gap between children's rights talk versus what's happening in children's lives.
Yeah, no, yeah, really interesting question. I think you can take this back to the 19th century again, as I always will. When you see this like rise of children's rights, kind of like activism, and kind of literature, and adults kind of, yeah, conceptualizing like what are children's rights and what do children have a right to. And oftentimes, yeah, it's hard to kind of see how children are responding to this. So like what children enacting their rights? Are they kind of like standing up for their rights in how the time and place is defining those rights? And yeah, I suppose it just comes back to questions of power. Like I think Em's work does this really well, is kind of grapples with ideas of like power, and who is exercising power and how they're exercising power, and maybe not necessarily in traditional ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, my work hasn't really engaged with the idea of child rights or children's rights. I suppose in my own work in particular, I've always been interested in how children use their imaginations to escape reality to some extent, and the ways in which they can empower themselves, kind of with their imaginative powers. So even though a child's, I suppose, I know their family life, their educational experience, their friends may not necessarily be aspects of their life that they're comfortable in, or they may even be violent. There are ways in which children are able to free themselves and liberate themselves from those realities, even if momentarily. And I've found that experience of empowering oneself, which children do talk about and do write about and they do draw about, to be an interesting way to also think about how doing children's history can open up new landscapes, new worlds, new ways of seeing that perhaps thinking about children's experiences from an adult perspective doesn't necessarily always allow.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer. And just to add to it, that there's obviously a legal framework of children's rights, but there's other kinds of sort of vernacular conceptions of rights as well. And I think Emily's written about sort of children's articulation of almost a right to public space and to kind of occupy public space, with some really interesting examples about like children digging trenches in parks to reenact First World War battles and things like that, that are really sort of good examples of a wider conception of rights in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the other question that had come in was about generally, do girls produce and keep written artifacts more than do boys? Which again, I think all of you can answer, but I might throw to Kat in the first instance as our girlhood expert, whether
Mm.
that holds true.
Um, I don't think it does. I think for certain times and places, maybe yes. I think there's a bit of an argument made by some historians of like letters and diaries that like the diary is like this feminized genre and therefore that girls are more likely to keep a diary in the 19th century. I think that is somewhat true. I think girls in 19th century kind of Anglophone world were more likely to keep what we might consider a traditional diary today, like a more I suppose exploratory kind of emotional diary in which they're kind of exploring their thoughts and feelings and their kind of day-to-day activities, which was often encouraged by their parents as a way to kind of regulate emotions and kind of think about how they're interacting with others in the world and often chastise themselves in a way and to be good kind of moral, pious girls. And boys aren't encouraged to do this as much. They're often too busy kind of often doing things. But I think when it comes to other types of sources like letters as well as schoolwork. I think it's very even in a lot of ways. Like both boys and girls are going to school in almost even numbers, not quite. From my period, girls are attending slightly less than boys. But yeah, I've come across a lot of letters from brothers and sisters, and it seems to be that girls and boys kind of are writing equally in a lot of ways. And some boys are keeping diaries, but often they're more kind of day diaries of what they're kind of doing, what they're kind of doing in their day to day. So I think they're writing maybe for different audiences and for different purposes, but they're not necessarily creating more or less than each other.
I don't know, Isobelle, did you want to jump in?
No, I thought that was a great answer, Kat. I just probably from my point of view, just some of the work because it's been on the feminist movement, girls are more represented there.
Yeah.
Again, so I think that's part of the question is what you're looking at.
Yeah, definitely.
Parameters there as
Yeah,
well.
and I was looking for girls
And
stuff, so I definitely probably same with you, Isabel. You find like women, like and girls' voices probably more often in the archive. But Em could probably speak to more like I suppose maybe like gender parity, I suppose, in the sources.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just echo what Kat would say. Yeah, I agree that what boys and girls produce can be different. Not always, but it can be that there are different patterns, different trends, but that both boys and girls are, at least in my period, producing quite large amounts of written and artistic creative work throughout that period. Yeah, I think that maybe some of the more obvious divisions are probably in things like play, and the ways in which girls and boys organize their play or engage in play. And of course, what's so interesting is the way in which girls and boys protect their play and their own culture from one another. And so children they have their own play practices, cultures, friendship circles that they maintain and protect for their own purposes on the playground, at home. So I think in play, often kind of these kinds of conversations around gender are really interesting. But I found, yeah, same as Kat, that in the archive, both are kind of producing a lot of textual material.
Yeah, and talking about a different kind of material culture and objects. I found that girls were more likely to produce kind of like things like art and craft in my period than boys. I think girls were a lot more often more encouraged to stay at home. It's a little bit not always like girls were often playing outside and playing in their neighborhoods and going to school and work. But I think the ideal was the girl was in the home, and often she was encouraged to craft and create things like scrapbooks or needlework as a way to kind of keep her somewhat contained and kind of under the watchful eye of female relatives. So, for instance, as part of my work, I looked at these big exhibitions, juvenile exhibitions, children's exhibitions that were held in the late 19th century, around 1879 to into the 1890s. And at some of the exhibitions, it could be to do with a range of factors, but girls are producing significantly more things than boys for these exhibitions. Boys are producing kind of things for apprentice pieces or maybe like carving kind of miniature models for apprenticeships or kind of penmanship or writing poems or writing essays. But girls are kind of producing a lot of things like art and craft and needlework and things like that. So I think maybe that's where one of the disparities can come through in a way.
Brilliant. So we have a question from Peter McPhee that's quite a specific one about have you used children's testimony in courts of law? And if so, what comments would you make about the problems of using this material? So yeah, again, the archive question always animates discussion.
Have either of you used any law, like court testimony?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Have you, Isabel? No.
No, no,
I'm
but if
probably
you
the closest with the coronial inquests, I suppose. I did try to look at court testimony, but it got a bit much, and there's just like a lot of stuff. And I, yeah, did a lot of reading around kind of like how do you read a child's testimony and how do you, children often weren't kind of seen as like good witnesses, I think, in the mid 19th century, in particular, and often I think. There's this kind of binary of the child as kind of being like a liar and maybe like not being trusted, and also the child as being innocent and the child as being, I suppose, like taken, their word kind of being a bit more veritable, obviously depending on race, class, ethnicity, all of that kind of comes into it. So I think you have to be really careful about like, I suppose, the layering that adults are putting on the child if they're giving testimony and whether they're even allowed to give testimony in a court case. But when it came to the coronial inquests, I found even though I don't think they're written verbatim, some of them seem to be written more verbatim than others. They're taken down by a court, by the clerk or whoever's working with the coroner. And they're often signed by the girl, and often she can sign her own name. So she's probably read the testimony and like read what she's written down. So I think you can take them, yeah, as obviously with any historical source, with whatever kind of caveats you need to in mind. But I think they provide a really interesting insight into, I suppose that I found the coronial inquest mostly interesting in just children's day to day. Like they often children have accidents and die playing or going to school or working. So you can kind of get an interesting insight into day-to-day lives and in a moment of tragedy, but it's a normal everyday occurrence happening before it. So that's how I found them really useful. But yeah, I think the court testimony is a little bit different. I think often because it's being recalled potentially a lot later after an event, and often for different circumstances, if a crime has been committed, for instance.
I think Simon Sliders used maybe a bit of this in his into kind of young people in the Melbourne urban space in the kind of colonial period. And I think what's kind of even I suppose a little bit in my own work, sometimes children become visible when they interact with the law in unusual ways. And like just one example of that in some of my own work, I'm particularly interested in kind of the supernatural and children's imaginings of kind of monsters and things like that. And there are a number of, say, of examples of where children kind of become visible in the newspapers under accounts of them engaging in kind of vandalism of haunted homes, which they find threatening or which they see a ghost in. It's just a really interesting and unusual example of how sometimes children become visible because they engage in activity that society deems unacceptable or criminal or whatever it is. Same as when they engage in protests, or you know, some of the schools, parents encourage children in particular not to attend school for various kind of reasons. And so in those cases, children do become visible, I think, in kind of interesting ways, I suppose.
Yeah. And Peter has followed up by bringing kind of a different regional perspective to point out that medieval ecclesiastical court records can be fascinating in their glimpses of childhood. Yeah, which I think is a really great point as well. We do have time for one or two more questions, I think. So in the absence of any currently in the thing, I might ask, oh, no, someone has come in. I wonder if the panel could reflect further on the place of the modern school institution in their work. Educational institutions seem to both empower children and help generate source material, and simultaneously to represent orthodoxy and conformity, even repression. And that seems like a very deep and complex question. So I'm going to throw it over to you immediately to say, does anyone have any thoughts on this?
They are such a central part of children's lives. So yes, I mean, I think that's exactly right. In my own work, I guess again, go back to the work from my book. School is one of the institutions I examine there because a lot of sort of debates around children's liberation have been focused around the school as a repressive institution. And schools, I guess, in that sense, have been interesting too, in terms of being places too, though, where children can organise, I guess, in the same way that children can play and do all sorts of other things they can organise within a school, because that's a community that they're in, and that's where their peers are. And they might organise amongst themselves, or they might be organising in alliance with teachers. So they are a really interesting space to look at. And I think from when thinking about questions of rights and also about children's political activism, schools are a central part of that history.
Yeah, no, jumping off that, yeah, they are so central to children's lives, but they haven't always been as well. Like it's a very recent phenomenon in which most children go to school. Like it's only like 1872 is when Victoria introduced free compulsory education, and from that, the attendance wasn't great, but children were meant to go to school up until they're around 13 years of age. And like be kind of pass a certificate in the end. But prior to that, children did go to school, but they were often fee paying or charitable schools, and there wasn't a lot of regulation. So I think, yeah, the centrality of school is really key. I think to all of our work, like it's in children's lives, it's always going to be a factor if you're looking at the 19th, 20th, or 21st century. And I think you can kind of look at, I suppose, I think this kind of idea of empowering children and like orthodoxy and like conformity and this idea of repression is like kind of stems back to why schools were created in the first place. I think it is partly to empower children or future citizens to be independent, and it's often tied to ideas of the nation state and industrial kind of capitalism, and creating these independent, I suppose, future adults who will be able to contribute to society and look after themselves. So it is like, I suppose, empowering in some ways and wanting children to become literate, so they can kind of make the best of their life in some ways. But it also is wanting to make everyone conform and be, I suppose, yeah, conform to like the ideals of what a state needs, to kind of like be the best version of itself in a way. So yeah, I think yeah, there's always this tension when you're looking at children at school, and I think it kind of stems back to I suppose adult intentions for schools, and then you can look at kind of what Isobelle was talking about, like children's intentions when they're using schools. So children are not always using the space of the school in the way that adults are intending that they use it, and often they are using it. It's meant to be a space to learn, but they're often using it as a space to socialize, to agitate, to create a sense of self and their own identity. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about looking at education and school in history.
Well, Em jumps into, I'm sure you've got more to say, but I think also just that schools are so important for defining where childhood ends as well. That's one of their functions in terms of when we're thinking about how we write histories of childhood, and that may be a good or bad thing, but because they operate in contemporary society in that way, as being that sort of that centralizing institution for such a long period in young people's lives. That's another reason why they figure so strongly in the work that historians of childhood do. And the same goes for histories of the family. And it's why those different areas also intersect so much.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned before, I think changes around the way teachers and educationalists were kind of responding or imagining children around the turn of the century is pretty critical to my work and to the archive, and how the archive has been shaped for children's historians now. Some of the largest collections, we sometimes call them giant collections of children's culture, were kind of crafted by educationalists, people that were interested in children's learning, in children's imaginative lives, and in children's, I suppose, being socialized really on growing up. And so I think the modern school institution, or the kind of particularly the format, the kind of stricter compulsory education, particularly at the primary school level, but also increasing number of children going to high school, is kind of critical to a particular type of childhood experience in the 20th century in particular, which has shaped my work, and probably a different way actually to Kat's to some extent, I think. Mm. It's interesting though, like, I mean, thinking about the school also as a place of conformity, and the ways in which children, even their imaginative lives, try to escape school, where they imagine futures for themselves or they imagine futures at school, which is really interesting to me. I think sometimes schools, particularly in this period, and particularly bush schools, can be an escape from the home, an escape from work and from labor and from domestic duties. And education, even though it can be a bit boring or even though it can be a bit monotonous, is also escape from a different kind of home environment, one that was difficult and sometimes violent. And so that kind of changes the way I think school is experienced for some children throughout this period.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the 19th century, especially when schooling becomes free, there's a lot of girls who go to school now that it's free because they can afford to go because they don't have to pay much. And yeah, just like this revelation of like meeting other children and like being with other children. A lot of the girls that I look at live in rural and very remote areas. And I think, yeah, they kind of see it potentially as this like, in a way, liberatory kind of space, or this space is different from home. And I think, yeah, it's a big feature that comes through in a lot of like the memoirs and things that I've read from that period. There's something else I was going to say. Yes, I think, and there's a lot of girls that do like, I understand this idea of like conformity and orthodoxy, but there's a lot of girls, especially at boarding schools and things, who like really embrace this idea of orthodoxy and conformity and really like lean into, I suppose, the this like cohort experience that they're able to have and kind of really, I think, enjoy the kind of routine of school, and enjoy kind of the diligence and patience that they have to show in the classroom, and is through the exercise books. They're really neat and colorful and very beautiful, and I think they're putting a lot of pride into their work and kind of potentially enjoying this kind of the structure that school's placing on them in a way, yeah, and enjoying learning.
I think that's important. I mean, sometimes I think it's important to remember that obviously the school experience for a lot of children was hard, because children can be very mean, they can be very cruel, and school environments can be like that. And bullying was, like today, it was a part of the school experience. And so I think it's important also to remember that as well, that even as we kind of, particularly in my work, that I look to the education space and look to schools as a kind of important archive of material, that yeah, there is this darker side to the school experience for a lot of children, and that kind of negotiation, yeah, of working out how you fit, where you fit, what the kind of person that you want to be, and how you deal with different situations, yeah, is also an important part of the story, I think.
Well, that was a brilliantly eloquent discussion that I think is a good place probably to finish, that we've held you long enough on a Thursday evening in November. So I'm just going to very quickly share the slide. Hopefully that's working. So I do just want to say thank you to all three of our brilliant speakers tonight. I believe one of the comments described your discussion as riveting, which I think is a perfect description. It was really fantastic. So thank you so much for being part of this. Also want to thank the behind the scenes team of Making Public Histories, Stephanie Holt and Molly McHugh from the History Council of Victoria, Margie Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and Natalie Nguyen from Monash University. Would also like to express our gratitude to Monash University Publishing for sponsoring the Making Public Histories seminar series. You can see some of the recent publications here. Now, this is the last of the Making Public History seminars for the year, but I hope you'll join us in 2025. We've lined up already a very awesome set of seminars. I won't give all of them away, but the first of these will be held on the 27th of March as part of Women's History Month, when Dr. Claire Wright and Dr. Karen Downing will be discussing the glass ceiling. So thank you very much again to our speakers, and hope to see many of you at future Making Public History seminars next year. Thanks.